Section 42 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Under the Yoke. As he was a man of quiet and regular habits, and of a simple and affectionate disposition, and had nothing to disturb the even tenor of his life, Monsieur de Loubancourt suffered more than most men do from his widowerhood. He regretted his lost happiness, was angry with fate, which separated united couples so brutally, and which made choice of a tranquil existence, whose sleepy quietude had not hitherto been troubled by any cares or chimeras, in order to rob it of its happiness. Had he been younger, he might perhaps have been tempted to form a new line, to fill up the vacant place, and to marry again. But when a man is nearly 60, such ideas make people laugh, for they have something ridiculous and insane about them. And so he dragged on his dull and weary existence, escaped from all those familiar objects which constantly recalled the past to him, and went from hotel to hotel without taking an interest in anything, without becoming intimate with anyone, even temporarily, inconsolable, silent, almost enigmatical, and looking funereal in his eternal black clothes. He was generally alone, though on rare occasions he was accompanied by his only son, who used to yawn by stealth, and who seemed to be mentally counting the hours, as if he were performing some hateful, enforced duty in spite of himself. 2 years of this crystallization went past, and one was as monotonous and as void of incident as the other. One evening, however, in a boarding-house at Cannes, where he was staying on his wanderings, there was a young woman dressed in mourning among the new arrivals, who sat next to him at dinner. She had a sad, pale face that told of suffering, a beautiful figure, and large blue eyes with deep rings round them, but which nevertheless looked like the first star which shines in the twilight. All remarked her, although he usually took no notice of women, no matter whatever they were, ugly or pretty. He looked at her and listened to her. He felt less lonely by her side, though he did not know why. He trembled with instinctive and confused happiness, just as if in some distant country he had found some female friend or relative who at last would understand him, tell him some news, and talk to him in his dear native language about everything that a man leaves behind him when he exiles himself from home. What strange affinity had thrown them together thus? What secret forces had brought their grief in contact? What made him so sanguine and so calm, and incited him to take her suddenly into his confidences, and urged him on to resistless curiosity? She was an experienced traveler, who had no illusions, and was in search of adventures, one of those women who frequently change their name, and who, as they have made up their minds to swindle if luck is not on their side, act as a continual part, an adventuress who could put on every accent, who, for the sake of her course, transformed herself into a Slav, or into an American, or simply into a provincial, who was ready to take part in any comedy in order to make money, and not to be obliged to waste her strength and her brains on fruitless struggles, or on wretched expedients. Thus she immediately guessed the state of this melancholy sexagenarian's mind, and the illusions which attracted him to her, and scented the spoils which offered themselves to her cupidity of their own accord, and divined under what guise she ought to show herself, to make herself accepted and loved. She initiated him into depths of grief which were unknown to him, by phrases which were cut short by sighs, by fragments of her story, which she finished by a disgusted shrug of the shoulders and a heart-rending smile, and by insensibly exciting his feelings. In a word, she triumphed over the last remaining doubts, which might still have mingled with the affectionate pity with which that poor, solitary heart, which so full of bitterness, overflowed. And so, for the first time since he had become a widower, the old man confided in another person, poured out his old heart into that soul which seemed to be so like his own, which seemed to offer him a refuge where he could be cheered up and where the wounds of his heart could be healed, and he longed to throw himself into those sisterly arms, to dry his tears and to exercise his grief there. Monsieur de Loubancourt, who had married at 25, as much from love as from judgment, had lived quietly and peacefully in the country, much more than in Paris. He was ignorant of the female wiles of temptations offered to creatures like Wanda Pulska, who was made up of lies and only cared for pleasure, a virgin soil on which any seed will grow. She attached herself to him, became his shadow, and by degrees part of his life. She showed herself to be a charitable woman who devoted herself to an unhappy man, who endeavored to console him, and who, in spite of her youth, was willing to be the inseparable companion of the old man in his slow daily walks. She never appeared to tire of his anecdotes and reminiscences, and she played cards with him. She waited on him carefully when he was confined to his bed, appeared to have no sex, and transformed herself. And though she handled him skillfully, she seemed ingenuous and ignorant of evil. She acted like an innocent young girl who had just been confirmed, but for all that, she chose dangerous hours and certain spots in which to be sentimental, and to ask questions which agitated and disconcerted him, and abandon her slender fingers to his feverish hands, which pressed and held them in a tender clasp. And then there were wild declarations of love, prayers and sobs which frightened her, wild adieux which were not followed by his departure, but which brought about a touching reconciliation and the first kiss. And then one night, while they were traveling together, he forced open the door of her bedroom at the hotel, which he had locked, and came in like a madman. There was the phantom of violence and the fallacious submission of a woman who was overcome by so much tenderness, who rebelled no longer, but who accepted the yoke of her master and lover. And then the conquest of the body after the conquest of the heart, which forged his chain link by link, pleasures which besought and corrupt old men, and dry up their brains, until at last he allowed himself to be induced, almost unconsciously, to make an odious and stupid will. Informed, perhaps, by anonymous letters, or astonished because his father kept him altogether at a distance from him and gave no signs of life, Monsieur de Loubancourt's son joined them in Provence. But Wanda Pulska, who had been preparing for that attack for a long time, waited for it fearlessly. She did not seem disconcerted at that sudden visit, but was very charming and affable towards the newcomer, reassured him by her careless airs of a girl who took life as it came, and who was suffering from the consequences of a fault, and did not trouble her head about the future. He envied his father, and grudged him such a treasure. Although he had come to combat her dangerous influence, and to treat the woman who had assumed the place of death, and who governed her lover as his sovereign mistress, as an enemy, he shrunk from his task, panted with desire, lost his head, and thought of nothing but treason and of an odious partnership. She managed him even more easily than she had managed Monsieur de Loubancourt, molded him just as she chose, made him her tool without even giving him the tips of her fingers, or granting him the slightest favor, induced him to be so imprudent that the old man grew jealous, watched them, discovered the intrigue, and found mad letters in which his son was angry, begged, threatened, and implored. One evening, when she knew that her lover had come in, and was hiding in a dark cupboard in order to watch them, Wanda happened to be alone in the drawing-room, which was full of light, of beautiful flowers, with this young fellow, 25. He threw himself at her feet and declared his love, and besought her to run away with him, and when she tried to bring him to reason and repulsed him, and told him in a loud and very distant voice how she loved Monsieur de Loubancourt, he seized her wrists with brutal violence, and, maddened with passion and stammering words of love and lust, He pushed her towards one of the couches. "Let me go," she said. "Let me go immediately. You are a brute to take advantage of a woman like that. Please let me go, or I shall call the servants to my assistance." The next moment the old man, terrible in his rage, rushed out of his hiding place with clenched fists and a slobbering mouth, threw himself on the startled son, and pointing to the door with a superb gesture, he said, "You are a dirty scoundrel, sir. Get out of my house immediately, and never let me see you again." The comedy was over. Grateful for such fidelity and real affection, Monsieur de Loubancourt married Wanda Pulska, whose name appeared on the civil register, which was a detail of no importance to a man who was in love, as Frida Krubstein. She came from Saxony, and had been a servant at an inn. Then he disinherited his son, as far as he could. And now that she is a respectable and respected widow, Madame de Loubancourt is received everywhere by society in those places of winter resort where people's bygone history is so rarely gone into, and where women bear a name, who are pretty and who can waltz, like the Germans can, are always well received. End of section 42. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 43 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Red One and the Other. "Well, really," Chasseval said, standing with his back to the fire, "could any of those respectable shopkeepers and wine growers have possibly believed that that pretty little Parisian woman, with her soft, innocent eyes like those of a Madonna, with such smiling lips and golden hair, and who always dressed so simple, was their candidate's mistress? She was a wonderful help to him, and accompanied him even to the most outlying farms, went to the meetings in the small village cafés, and had a pleasant and suitable word for everyone, and did not recoil at a glass of mulled wine or a grip of the hand, and was always ready to join in farandole. She seemed to be so in love with Élian Rouller, to trust him so entirely, to be so proud of forming half of his life, and of belonging to him, gave him such looks of full pleasure and of hope, and listened to all he said so intently that voters who might have hesitated allowed themselves by degrees to be talked over and persuaded, and promised their votes to the young doctor whose name they never heard mentioned in the district before. That electoral campaign had been like a truant's escapade for Jane Dardenne. It was a delightful and unexpected holiday, and as she was an actress at heart, she played her part seriously, and threw herself into her character, and enjoyed herself more than she ever enjoyed herself in her most adventurous outings. And then there came in the pleasure of being taken for a woman of the world, of being flattered, respected, and envied, and of getting out of the usual groove for a time, and also the dream that this journey of a few weeks would have the sequence that her lover would not separate from her on their return, but would sacrifice the woman whom he no longer loved, and whom he ironically used to call his Cinderella, to her. At night, when they had laid aside all pretense, and when they were alone in their room in the hotel, she coaxed him and flattered him, spurred his ambition on, threw her quivering arms round him, and amidst her kisses whispered those words to him which make a man proud and warm his heart and give him strength like a stout dram of alcohol. The two between them captured the district and won the election easily, and in spite of his youth, Élian Rouller was chosen by a majority of 5,000. Then, of course, there were more fêtes and banquets at which Jane was present, and where she was received with enthusiastic shouts. There were fireworks when she was obliged to set light to the first rocket, and balls at which she astonished those worthy people by her affability. And when they left, 3 little girls dressed in white, as if they were going to be confirmed, came onto the platform and recited some complimentary verses to her while the band played the Marseillaise. The women waved their pocket handkerchiefs, and the men their hats, and leaning out of the carriage window, looking charming in her traveling costume, with a smile on her lips and with moist eyes, as was fitting at such a pathetic leave-taking, actress as she was, with a sudden and childlike gesture, she blew kisses to them from the tips of her fingers and said, "Goodbye, my friends. Goodbye only for the present. I shall never forget you." The deputy, who was also very effusive, had invited his principal supporters to come and see him in Paris, as there were plenty of excursion trains. They all took him at his word, and Weir was obliged to invite them all to dinner. In order to avoid any possible mishaps, he gave his wife a foretaste of their guests. He told her that they were rather noisy, talkative, and unpolished, and that they would no doubt astonish her by their manners and their accent, but that as they had great influence and were excellent men, they deserved a good reception. It was a very useful precaution, for when they came into the drawing-room in their new clothes, expanding with pleasure, and with their hair pomatumed as if they had been going to a country wedding, they felt inclined to fall down before the new Madame Weir, to whom the deputy introduced them, and who seemed to be perfectly at home there. At first they were embarrassed, felt uncomfortable and out of place, did not know what to say, and had to seek their words. They buttoned and unbuttoned their gloves, answered her questions at random, and racked their brains to discover the solution of the enigma. Captain Maupassant looked at the fire with the fixed gaze of a somnambulist. Marius Barbaste scratched his fingers mechanically, while the three others, the factory manager Casmahel, Roqueton the lawyer, and Duguay the hotel proprietor, looked at Weir anxiously. The lawyer was the first to recover himself. He got up from his armchair laughing heartily, dug the deputy in the ribs with his elbow, and said, "I understand it all. I understand it. You thought that people do not come to Paris to be bored, eh? Madame is delightful, and I congratulate you, monsieur." He gave a wink and made signs behind his back to his friends, and then the captain had his turn. "We are not boobies, and that fellow Roqueton is the most knowing of the lot of us. Ah, Monsieur Weir, without any exaggeration, you are the cream of good fellows." And with a flushed face and expanding his chest, he said sonorously, "They certainly turn them out very pretty in your part of the country, my little lady." Madame Weir, who did not know what to say, had gone up to her husband for protection, but she felt much inclined to go to her own room under some pretext or other, in order to escape from her intolerable task. She kept her ground, however, during the whole of dinner, which was a noisy, jovial meal, during which the 5 electors, with their elbows on the table, and their waistcoats unbuttoned and half drunk, told coarse stories and swore like troopers. But as the coffee and the liqueurs were served in the smoking-room, she took leave of her guests in an impatient voice, and went to her own room with the hasty step of an escaped prisoner who is afraid of being retaken. The electors sat staring after her with gaping mouths, and Maupassant lit a cigar and said, "Just listen to me, Monsieur Weir. It was very kind of you to invite us here, to your little quiet establishment, but to speak to you frankly, I should not, in your place, wrong my lawful wife for such a stuck-up piece of goods as this one is." "The captain is right," Roqueton the notary opined. "Madame Weir, the lawful Madame Weir, is much more amiable and altogether nicer. You are a scoundrel to deceive her. But when may we hope to see her?" And with a paternal grimace he added, "But do not be uneasy. We will all hold our tongue. It would be too sad if she were to find it out." End of section 43. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 44 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Upstart. You know good-natured, stout Dupontel, who looks like the type of a happy man with his fat cheeks that are the color of ripe apples, his small reddish mustache turned up over his thick lips, with his prominent eyes, which never know any emotion or sorrow, which remind one of the calm eyes of cows and oxen, and his long back fixed onto two little wriggling crooked legs, which obtained for him the nickname of Corkscrew from some nymph of the ballet. Dupontel, who had taken the trouble to be born, but not like the grand seigneurs whom Beaumarchais made fun of once upon a time, was ballasted with a respectable number of millions, as is becoming in the sole heir of a house that had sold household utensils and appliances for over a century. Naturally, like every other upstart who respects himself, he wished to appear something, to play at being a clubman, and also to play to the gallery, because he had been educated at Vaugirard and knew a little English, because he had gone through his voluntary service in the army for 12 months at Rouen, because he was a tolerable singer, could drive four-in-hands and play lawn tennis. Always studiedly well-dressed, too correct in every way, copying his way of speaking, his hats and his trousers from the 3 or 4 snobs who set the fashion, reproducing other people's witticisms, learning anecdotes and jokes by heart, like a lesson, to use them again at small parties, constantly laughing without knowing why his friends burst into roars of merriment, and was in the habit of keeping pretty girls for the pleasure of his best friends. Of course he was a perfect fool, but after all, a capital fellow, to whom it was only right to extend a good deal of indulgence. When he had taken his 31st mistress, and had made the discovery that in love money does not create happiness 2/3 of the time, that they had all deceived him and made him perfectly ridiculous at the end of the week, Charles Dupontel made up his mind to settle down as a respectable married man, and to marry, not from calculation or from reason, but for love. One autumn afternoon at Auteuil, he noticed in front of the club stand, among the number of pretty women who were standing round the braziers, a girl with such lovely, delicate complexion that it looked like an apple blossom. Her hair was like threads of gold, and she was so slight and supple that she reminded him of those outlines of saints which one sees in old stained-glass church windows. There was also something enigmatical about her, for she had at the same time the delightfully ingenious look of a schoolgirl during the holidays, and also of some enlightened young lady who already knew the how and why of everything, who is exuberant with youth and life, and who is eagerly waiting for the moment when marriage will at length allow her to say and to do everything that comes into her head, and to amuse herself to satiety. Then she had such small feet that they would have gone into a woman's hand, a waist that could have been clasped by a bracelet, turned-up eyelashes which fluttered like the wings of a butterfly, clothes on an impudent and sensual nose, and a vague, mocking smile that made folds in her lips like the petals of a rose. Her father was a member of the Jockey Club, who was generally cleared out, as they call it, in the great races, but who yet defended his position bravely, and continued that, and who kept himself afloat by prodigies of coolness and skill. He belonged to a race which could prove that his ancestors had been at the court of Charlemagne, and not as musicians or cooks, as some people declared. Her youth and beauty and her father's pedigree dazzled Dupontel, upset his brain, and altogether turned him upside down, and combined they seemed to him to be a mirage of happiness and of pride of family. He got introduced to her father at the end of a game of baccarat, invited him to shoot with him, and a month later, as if it were an affair to be hurried over, he asked for and obtained the hand of Mademoiselle Thérèse de Montsagne, and felt as happy as a miner who has discovered a vein of precious metal. The young woman did not require more than 24 hours to discover that her husband was nothing but a ridiculous puppet, and immediately set about to consider how she might best escape from her cage and befool the poor fellow who loved her with all his heart. And she deceived him without the least pity or the slightest scruple. She did it as if it were from instinctive hatred, as if it were a necessity for her not only to make him ridiculous, but also to forget that she ought to sacrifice her virgin dreams to him, to belong to him, and to submit to his hateful caresses without being able to defend himself and to repel him. She was cruel, as all women are when they do not love, delighted in doing audacious and absurd things, and in visiting everything, and in braving danger. She seemed like a young colt that is intoxicated with the sun, the air, and its liberty, and which gallops wildly across the meadows, jumps hedges and ditches, kicks and whinnies joyously, and rolls about in the long, sweet grass. But Dupontel remained quite imperturbable. He had not the slightest suspicion, and was the first to laugh when anybody told him some good story of a husband who had been cuckolded, although his wife repelled him, quarreled with him, and constantly pretended to be out of sorts or tired out in order to escape from him. She seemed to take a malicious pleasure in checkmating him by her personal remarks, her disenchanting answers, and her apparent listlessness. They saw a great deal of company, and he called himself Dupontel now, and he even had thoughts of buying a title from the Pope. He only read certain newspapers, kept up a regular correspondence with the Orléans princes, was thinking of starting a racing stable, and finished up by believing that he really was a fashionable man, and strutted about and was puffed out with conceit, as he had probably never read La Fontaine's fable, in which he tells the story of the ass that is laden with relics which people salute, and so takes their bows to himself. Suddenly, however, anonymous letters disturbed his quietude and tore the bandage from his eyes. At first he tore them up without reading them, and shrugged his shoulders disdainfully. But he received so many of them, and the writer seemed so determined to dot his i's and cross his t's, and to clear his brain for him, that the unhappy man began to grow disturbed, and to watch, and to ferret about. He instituted minute inquiries, and arrived at the conclusion that he no longer had the right to make fun of other husbands, and that he was the perfect counterpart of Ganarelle. Furious at having been duped, he set a whole private inquiry agency to work, continually acted a part, and one evening appeared unexpectedly with a commissary of police in the snug little bachelor's quarters which concealed his wife's escapades. Therese, who was terribly frightened, and at her wits' end at being thus surprised in all the disorder of her lover's apartments, and pale with shame and terror, hid herself behind the bed-curtains, while he, who was an officer of dragoons, very much vexed at being mixed up in such a pinchbeck scandal, and at being caught in a silk shirt by these men who were so correctly dressed in frock-coats, frowned angrily, and had to restrain himself so as not to fling his victim out of a window. The police commissary, who was calmly looking at this little scene with the coolness of an amateur, prepared to verify the fact that they were caught flagrante delicto, and in an ironical voice said to her husband, who had claimed his services, "I must ask for your name in full, monsieur." "Charles Joseph Edward Dupontel," was the answer. And as the commissary was writing it down from his dictation, he added suddenly, "Dupontel in 2 words, if you please, monsieur le commissionnaire." End of section 44. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 45 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Carter's Wench. The driver, who had jumped from his box and was now walking slowly by the side of his thin horses, waking them up every moment by a cut of the whip or a coarse oath, pointed to the top of the hill, where the windows of a solitary house in which the inhabitants were still up, although it was very late and quite dark, were shining like yellow lamps, and said to me, "One gets a good drop there, monsieur, and well served, by George." and his eyes flashed in his thin, sunburnt face, which was of a deep brick-dust color, while he smacked his lips like a drunkard who remembers a bottle of good liquor that he has lately drunk, and drawing himself up in a blouse like a vulgar swell, he shivered like the back of an ox when it is sharply pricked with the goad. Yes, and well served by a wench who will turn your head for you before you have tilted your elbow and drank a glass. The moon was rising behind the snow-covered mountain peaks, which looked almost like blood under its rays, and which were crowned by dark, broken clouds which whirled about and floated, and reminded the passenger of some terrible Medusa's head. The gloomy plains of Capsir, which were traversed by torrents, extensive meadows in which undefined forms were moving about, fields of rye like huge golden table covers, and here and there wretched villagers and broad sheets of water into which the stars seemed to look in a melancholy manner, opened out to the view. Damp gusts of winds swept along the road, bringing a strong smell of hay, of resin of unknown flowers with them, and erratic pieces of rock, which were scattered on the surface like huge boundary stones, had spectral outlines. The driver pulled his broad-brimmed felt hat over his eyes, twirled his large mustache, and said in an obsequious voice, "Does monsieur wish to stop here? This is the place." It was a wretched wayside public house with a reddish slate roof that looked as if it were suffering from leprosy, and before the door there stood 3 wagons drawn by mules, and loaded with huge stems of trees, and which took up nearly the whole of the road. The animals, which were used to hauling there, were dozing, and their heavy loads exhaled a smell of pillaged forest. Inside, 3 wagoners, one of whom was an old man, while the other 2 were young, were sitting in front of the fire, which cackled loudly, with bottles and glasses on a large round table by their side, and were singing and laughing boisterously. A woman with large round hips and with a lace cap pinned onto her hair in the Catalan fashion, who looked strong and bold, and who had a certain amount of gracefulness about her, and with a pretty but untidy head, was urging them to undo the strings of their great leather purses, and replied to their somewhat indelicate jokes in a shrill voice, as she sat on the knee of the youngest, and allowed him to kiss her and to fumble in her bodice without any signs of shame. The coachman pushed open the door, like a man who knows that he is at home. "Good evening, Glaizette, and everybody. There is room for 2 more, I suppose?" The wagoners did not speak, but looked at us cunningly and angrily, like dogs whose food had been taken from them, and who showed their teeth ready to bite, while the girl shrugged her shoulders and looked into their eyes like some female wild beast tamer. And then she asked us with a strange smile, "What am I to get you?" "2 glasses of cognac, and the best you have in the cupboard, Glaizette," the coachman replied, rolling a cigarette. While she was uncorking the bottle, I noticed how green her eyeballs were. It was a fascinating, tempting green, like that of the great green grasshopper, and also how small her hands were, which showed that she did not use them much. How white her teeth were, and how her voice, which was rather rough, though cooing, had a cruel and at the same time a coaxing sound. I fancied I saw her, as in a mirage, reclining triumphantly on a couch, indifferent to the fights which were going on about her, always waiting, longing for him who would prove himself the stronger and who would prove victorious. She was, in short, the hospitable dispenser of love by the side of that difficult, stony road, who opened her arms to poor men, and who made them forget everything in the profusion of her kisses. She knew dark matters which nobody in the world besides herself should know, which her sealed lips would carry away inviolate to the other world. She had never yet loved, and would never really love, because she was vowed to passing kisses which were so soon forgotten. I was anxious to escape from her as soon as possible, no longer to see her pale green eyes and her mouth that bestowed caresses from pure charity, no longer to feel the woman with her beautiful white hands so near one. So I threw her a piece of gold and made my escape without saying a word to her, without waiting for any change, and without even wishing her good night, for I felt the caress of her smile and the disdainful restlessness of her looks. The carriage started off at a gallop to Formiguère, amidst a furious jingling of bells. I could not sleep any more. I wanted to know where that woman came from, but I was ashamed to ask the driver and to show any interest in such a creature. And when he began to talk, as we were going up another hill, as if he had guessed my sweet thoughts, he told me all he knew about Glizette. I listened to him with the attention of a child to whom somebody is telling some wonderful fairy tale. She came from Fontpédrouze, a muleteer's village, where the men spend their time in drinking and gambling at the inn, when they are not traveling on the high roads with their mules, while the women do all the field work, carry the heaviest loads on their back, and lead a life of pain and misery. Her father kept an inn. The girl grew up very happy. She was courted before she was 15, and was so coquettish that she was certain to be almost always found in front of her looking-glass, smiling at her own beauty, arranging her hair, trying to make herself like a young lady on the Prado. And now, as none of the family knew how to keep a halfpenny, but spent more than they earned, and were like cracked jugs from which the water escapes drop by drop, they found themselves ruined one fine day, just as if they had been at the bottom of a blind alley. So, on the feast of Our Lady of Succor, when people go on a pilgrimage to Font Romea, and the villages are consequently deserted, the innkeeper set fire to the house. The crime was discovered through La Glizette, who could not make up her mind to leave the looking-glass with which her room was adorned behind her, and so had carried it off under her petticoat. The parents were sentenced to many years' imprisonment, and being let loose to live as best she could, the girl became a servant, passed from hand to hand, inherited some property from an old farmer whom she had caught, as if she had been a thrush on a twig covered with bird-lime. And with the money she had built this public house on the new road, which was being built across the Capsier. "A regular bad one, monsieur," the coachman said in conclusion. "A vixen such as one does not see now in the worst garrison towns, and who would open the door to the whole fraternity, and not at all avaricious, but thoroughly honest." I interrupted him in spite of myself, as if his words had pained me, and I thought of those pale green eyes, those magic eyes, eyes to be dreamt about, which were the color of grasshoppers, and I looked at them and saw them in the darkness. They danced before me like phosphorescent lights, and I would have given then the whole contents of my purse to that man, if he would only have been silent and urged his horses on to full speed, so that their mad gallop might carry me off quickly, quickly and far, and continually further from that girl. End of section 45. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 46 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Marquise. It was quite useless to expostulate when that obstinate little Sonia, with a Russian name and Russian caprices, had said, "I choose to do it." She was so delicate and pretty also, with her slightly turned-up nose, and her rosy and childish cheeks, while every female perversity was reflected in the depths of her strange eyes, which were the color of the sea on a stormy evening. Yes, she was very charming, very fantastic, and above all, so Russian, so deliciously and imperiously Russian, and all the more Russian as she came from Montmartre. And in spite of this, not one of her 7 lovers who composed her usual menagerie had laughed when their enslavers said one day, "You know my feudal castle at Ploudun-et-Loire, near Saint-Jacques-de-la-Mer, which I bought 2 years ago, and in which I have not yet set foot? Very well, then. The day after tomorrow, which is the 1st of May, we will have a housewarming there." The 7 had not asked for any further explanation, but had accompanied little Sonia, and were now ready to sit down to dinner under her presidency in the dining room of the old castle, which was situated 10 hours from Paris. They had arrived there that morning. They were going to have dinner and supper together, and start off again at daybreak next morning. Such were Sonia's orders, and nobody had made the slightest objection. 2 of her admirers, however, who were not yet used to her sudden whims, had felt some surprise, which was quickly checked by expressions of enthusiastic pleasure on the part of the others. "What a delightful original idea! Nobody else would have thought of such things, positively nobody else. Oh, these Russians!" But those who had known her for some time, and who had been consequently educated not to be surprised at anything, found it all quite natural. It was 6:30 in the evening, and the gentlemen were going to dress. Sonia had made up her mind to keep on her morning gown, or if she dressed, she would do so later. Just then she was not inclined to move out of her great rocking chair, from which she could see the sun setting over the sea. The sight always delighted her very much. It might have been taken for a large red billiard ball, rebounding from the green cloth. How funny it was, and how lucky that she was all alone to look at it, for those 7 would not have understood it at all. Those men never have any soul, have they? Certainly the sunset was strange at first, but at length it made her sad, and just now Sonia's heart felt almost heavy, though the very sadness was sweet. She was congratulating herself more than ever on being alone, so as to enjoy that languor, which was almost like a gentle dream, when, in perfect harmony with that melancholy and sweet sensation, a voice rose from the road, which was overhung by the terrace. A tremulous but fresh and pure voice sang the following words to a slow melody. "Walking in Paris, having my drink, a friend of mine whispered, 'What do you think? If love makes you thirsty, then wine makes you lusty.'" The sound died away as the singer continued on his way, and Sonia was afraid that she should not hear the rest. It was really terrible. So she jumped out of the rocking chair, ran to the balustrade of terrace, and leaning over it, she called out, "Sing it again! I insist on it! The song, the whole song!" On hearing this, the singer looked round and then came back, without hurrying, however, and as if he were prompted by curiosity rather than by any desire to comply with her order, and holding his hand over his eyes, he looked at Sonia attentively, who, on her part, had plenty of time to look closely at him. He was an old man of about 65, and his rags and the wallet over his shoulder denoted a beggar. But Sonia immediately noticed that there was a certain amount of affectation in his wretchedness. His hair and beard were not shaggy and ragged like such men usually wear them, and evidently he had his hair cut occasionally, and he had a fine and even distinguished face, as Sonia said to herself. But she did not pay much attention to that, as for some time she had noticed that old men at the seaside nearly all looked like gentlemen. When he got to the foot of the terrace, the beggar stopped and wagged his head and said, "Pretty! The little woman is very pretty." But he did not obey Sonia's order, who repeated it almost angrily this time, beating a violent tattoo on the stonework. "The song! The whole song!" He did not seem to hear, but stood there gaping, with a vacant smile on his face. And as his head was rather inclined towards his left shoulder, a thin stream of saliva trickled from his lips onto his beard, and his looks became more and more ardent. "How stupid I am!" Sonia suddenly thought. "Of course he is waiting for something." She felt in her pocket, in which she always carried some gold, by way of halfpence, took out a 20-franc piece and threw it down to the old man. He, however, did not take any notice of it, but continued looking at her ecstatically, and was only roused from his state of bliss by receiving a handful of gravel which she threw at him right in his face. "Do sing," she exclaimed. "You must. I will have it. I have paid you." And then, still smiling, he picked up the Napoleon and threw it back onto the terrace. And then he said proudly, though in a very gentle voice, "I do not ask for charity, little lady, but if it gives you pleasure, I will sing you the whole song, the whole of it, as often as you please." And he began the song again in his tremulous voice, which was more tremulous than it had been before, as if he were much touched. Sonia was overcome, and without knowing was moved into tears, delighted because the man had spoken to her so familiarly, and rather ashamed at having treated him as a beggar. And now her whole being was carried away by the slow rhythm of the melody, which related an old love story. And when he had done, he again looked at her with a smile, and as she was crying, he said to her, "I dare say you have a beautiful horse or a little dog that you are very fond of, which is ill. Take me to it, and I will cure it. I understand it thoroughly. I will do it gratis, because you are so pretty." She could not help laughing. "You must not laugh," he said. "What are you laughing at? Because I am poor? But I'm not, for I had work yesterday, and again today. I have a bag full. See, look here." And from his belt he drew a leather purse in which coppers rattled. He poured them out into the palm of his hand, and said merrily, "You see, little one, I have a purse. 47 sous. 47. "So you will not take my Napoleon?" Sonia said. "Certainly not," he replied. "I do not want it. And then I tell you again I will not accept alms. So you do not know me?" "No, I do not." "Very well. Ask anyone in the neighborhood. Everybody will tell you that the Marquise does not live on charity." The Marquise. At that name, she suddenly remembered that 2 years ago she had heard his story. It was at the time that she bought the property, and the vendor had mentioned the Marquise as one of the curiosities of the soil. He was said to be half silly, at any rate an original, almost in his dotage, living by any lucky bits that he could make as horse-coper and veterinary. The peasants gave him a little work, as they feared that he might throw spells over anyone who refused to employ him. They also respected him on account of his former wealth and of his title, for he had been rich, very rich, and they said that he really was a marquis, and it was said that he had ruined himself in Paris by speculating. The reason, of course, was women. At that moment the dinner bell began to ring, and a wild idea entered Sonia's head. She ran to the little door that opened onto the terrace, overtook the musician, and with a ceremonious bow she said to him, "Will you give me the pleasure and the honor of dining with me, Marquise?" The old man left off smiling and grew serious. He put his hand to his forehead as if to bring old recollections back, and then with a very formal, old-fashioned bow, he said, "With pleasure, my dear," and letting his wallet drop, he offered Sonia his arm. When she introduced this new guest to them, all the 7, even to the best drilled, started. "I see what disturbs you," she said. "It is his dress. Well, it really leaves much to be desired. But wait a moment, that can soon be arranged." She rang for her lady's maid and whispered something to her, and then she said, "Marquise, your bath is ready in your dressing room. If you will follow Sabina, she will show you to it. These gentlemen and I will wait dinner for you." And as soon as he had gone out, she said to the youngest there, "And now, Ernest, go upstairs and undress. I will allow you to dine in your morning coat, and you will give your dress coat and the rest to Sabina for the Marquise. Ernest was delighted at having to play a part in the piece, and the 6 others clapped their hands. Nobody else could think of such things. Nobody. Half an hour later they were sitting at dinner, the Marquise in a dress coat on Sonia's left, and it was a great deception for the 7. They had reckoned on having some fun with him, and especially Ernest, who set up as a wit, had intended to draw him. But at the first attempt of this sort, Sonia had given him a look which they all understood, and dinner began very ceremoniously for the 7, but merrily and without restraint between Sonia and the old man. They cut very long faces, those 7, but inwardly, if one can say so, for of course they could not dream of showing how put out they were, and those inward long faces grew longer still when Sonia said to the old fellow quite suddenly, "I say, how stupid these gentlemen are! Suppose we leave them to themselves." The Marquise rose, offered her his arm again, and said, "Where shall we go to?" But Sonia's only reply was to sing the couplet of that song which she had remembered. "For 3 years I passed the nights with my love, in a beautiful bed, in a splendid alcove. Though wine makes me sleepy, yet love keeps me frisky." And the 7, who were altogether dumbfounded this time, and who could not conceal their vexation, saw the couple disappear out of the door which led to Sonia's apartments. Ernest ventured to say. "This is really rather strong." "Yes," the eldest of the menagerie replied. "It certainly is rather strong, but it will do. You know, there is nobody like her for thinking of such things." The next morning the chateau bell woke them up at 6 o'clock, when they had agreed to return to Paris, and the 7 men asked each other whether they should go and wish Sonia good morning, as usual, before she was out of her room. Ernest hesitated more than any of them about it, and it was not until Sabina, her maid, came and told them that her mistress insisted upon it that they could make up their minds to do so, and they were surprised to find Sonia in bed by herself. "Well," Ernest asked boldly, "and what about the Marquise?" "He left very early," Sonia replied. "A queer sort of Marquise, I must say," Ernest observed contemptuously and growing bolder. "Why, I should like to know?" Sonia replied, drawing herself up. "The man has his own habits, I suppose." "Do you know, madam," Sabina observed, "that he came back half an hour after he left?" "Ah," Sonia said, getting up and walking about the room. "He came back. What did he want, I wonder?" "He did not say, madam. He merely went upstairs to see you. He was dressed in his old clothes again." And suddenly Sonia uttered a loud cry and clapped her hands, and the 7 came round to see what had caused her emotion. "Look here, just look here," she cried. "Do look on the mantelpiece. It is really charming. Do look." And with a smiling and yet somewhat melancholy expression in her eyes, with a tender look which they could not understand, she showed them a small bunch of wild flowers by the side of a heap of halfpennies. Mechanically she took them up and counted them, and then began to cry. There were 47 of them. End of section 46. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 47 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. The Bed. On a hot afternoon during last summer, the large auction rooms seemed asleep, and the auctioneers were knocking down the various lots in a listless manner. In a back room on the first floor, 2 or 3 lots of old silk, ecclesiastical vestments, were lying in a corner. They were copes for solemn occasions, and graceful chasubles on which embroidered flowers surrounded symbolic letters on a yellowish ground, which had become cream-colored, although it had originally been white. Some second-hand dealers were there, 2 or 3 men with dirty beards, and a fat woman with a big stomach, one of those women who deal in second-hand finery, and who also manage illicit love affairs, who are brokers in old and young human flesh just as much as they are in new and old clothes. Presently a beautiful Louis XV chasuble was put up for sale, which was as pretty as the dress of a marchioness of that period. It had retained all its colors, and was embroidered with lilies of the valley round the cross, and long blue iris, which came up to the foot of the sacred emblem, and wreaths of roses in the corners. When I had bought it, I noticed that there was a faint scent about it, as if it were permeated with the remains of incense, or rather as if it were still pervaded by those delicate, sweet scents of bygone years, which seemed to be only the memory of perfumes, the soul of evaporated essences. When I got it home, I wished to have a small chair of the same period covered with it, and as I was handling it, in order to take the necessary measures, I felt some paper beneath my fingers, and when I cut the lining, some letters fell at my feet. They were yellow with age, and the faint ink was the color of rust, and outside the sheet, which was folded in the fashion of years long past, it was addressed in a delicate hand to Monsieur l'Abbé d'Argence. The first 3 lines merely settled places of meeting, but here is the third. My friend, I am very unwell, ill, in fact, and I cannot leave my bed. The rain is beating against my windows, and I lie dreaming comfortably and warmly on my eiderdown coverlet. I have a book of which I am very fond, and which seems as if it really applied to me. Shall I tell you what it is? No, for you would only scold me. Then, when I have read a little, I think, and will tell you what about. Having been in bed for 3 days, I think about my bed, and even in my sleep I meditate on it still. And I have come to the conclusion that the bed constitutes our whole life, for we were born in it, we live in it, and we shall die in it. If, therefore, I had Monsieur de Crébillon's pen, I should write the history of a bed. And what exciting and terrible, as well as delightful moving occurrences would not such a book contain? What lessons and what subjects for moralizing could one not draw from it, for everyone? You know my bed, my friend, but you will never guess how many things I have discovered in it within the last 3 days, and how much more I love it in consequence. It seems to me to be inhabited, haunted, if I may say so, by a number of people I never thought of, who, nevertheless, have left something of themselves in that couch. Ah, I cannot understand people who buy new beds, beds to which no memories or cares are attached. Mine, ours, which is so shabby and so spacious, must have held many existences in it, from birth to the grave. Think of that, my friend. Think of it all. Review all those lives, a great part of which was spent between these 4 posts, surrounded by these hangings, embroidered by human figures, which have seen so many things. What have they seen during the 3 centuries since they were first put up? Here is a young woman lying on this bed. From time to time she sighs, and then she groans and cries out. Her mother is with her, and presently a little creature that makes a noise like a cat mewing, and which is all shriveled and wrinkled, comes from her. It is a male child to which she has given birth, and the young mother feels happy in spite of her pain. She is nearly suffocated with joy at that first cry, and stretches out her arms, and those around her shed tears of pleasure, for that little morsel of humanity which has come from her means the continuation of the family, the perpetuation of the blood, of the heart, and of the soul of the old people, who are looking on, trembling with excitement. And then, here are 2 lovers, who for the first time are flesh to flesh together in that tabernacle of life. They tremble, but transported with delight, they have the delicious sensation of being close together, and by degrees their lips meet. That divine kiss makes them one, that kiss which is the gate of a terrestrial heaven, that kiss which speaks of human delights, which continually promises them, announces them, and precedes them. And their bed is agitated like the tempestuous sea, and it bends and murmurs, and itself seems to become animated and joyous, for the maddening mystery of love is being accomplished on it. What is there sweeter? What more perfect in this world than those embraces which make one single being out of two, and which give to both of them at the same moment the same thought, the same expectation, and the same maddening pleasure, which descends upon them like a celestial and devouring fire? Do you remember those lines from some old poet, which you read to me last year? I do not remember who wrote them, but it may have been Rousard. When you and I in bed shall lie, lascivious we shall be, enlaced, playing 1,000 tricks of lovers gamesomely. I should like to have that verse embroidered on the top of my bed, where Pyramus and Thisbe are continually looking at me out of their tapestry eyes. And think of death, my friend, of all those who have breathed out their last sigh to God in this bed. For it is also the tomb of hopes ended, the door which closes everything, after having been the one which lets in the world. What cries, what anguish, what sufferings, what groans, how many arms stretched out towards the past, what appeals to happiness that has vanished forever, what convulsions, what death rattles, what gaping lips and distorted eyes have there not been in this bed, from which I am writing to you, during the 3 centuries that it has sheltered human beings? The bed, you must remember, is the symbol of life. I have discovered this within the last 3 days. There is nothing good except the bed, and are not some of our best moments spent in sleep? But then again, we suffer in bed. It is the refuge of those who are ill and suffering, a place of repose and comfort for worn-out bodies. And, in a word, the bed is part and parcel of humanity. Many other thoughts have struck me, but I have no time to note them down for you. And then, should I remember them all? Besides that, I am so tired that I mean to retire to my pillows, stretch myself out at full length, and sleep a little. But be sure and come to see me at 3 o'clock tomorrow. Perhaps I may be better, and able to prove it to you. Goodbye, my friend. Here are my hands for you to kiss, and I also offer you my lips. End of section 47. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 48 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. An Adventure in Paris. Is there any stronger feeling than curiosity in a woman? Oh, fancy seeing, knowing, touching what one has dreamt about. What would a woman not do for that? When once a woman's eager curiosity is aroused, she will be guilty of any folly, commit any imprudence, venture upon anything, and recoil from nothing. I am speaking of women who are really women, who are endowed with that triple-bottomed disposition, which appears to be reasonable and cold on the surface, but whose 3 secret compartments are filled. The first, with female uneasiness, which is always in a state of flutter. The next, with sly tricks which are colored in imitation of good faith, with those sophistical and formidable tricks of apparently devout women. And the last, with all those charming improper acts, with that delightful deceit, exquisite perfidy, and all those wayward qualities which drive lovers who are stupidly credulous to suicide, but which delight others. The woman whose adventure I am about to relate was a little person from the provinces, who had been insipidly chaste till then. Her life, which was apparently so calm, was spent at home, with a busy husband and 2 children, whom she brought up like an irreproachable woman. But her heart beat with unsatisfied curiosity and some unknown longing. She was continually thinking of Paris, and read the fashionable papers eagerly. The accounts of parties, of the dresses and various entertainments, excited her longing. But above all, she was strangely agitated by those paragraphs which were full of double meaning, by those veils which were half raised by clever phrases, and which gave her a glimpse of culpable and ravishing delights. And from her country home she saw Paris in an apotheosis of magnificent and corrupt luxury. And during the long nights when she dreamt, lulled by the regular snores of her husband, who was sleeping on his back by her side with a silk handkerchief tied round his head, she saw, in her sleep, those well-known men whose names appeared on the first page of the newspapers as great stars in the dark skies, and she pictured to herself their life of continual excitement, of constant debauches, of orgies such as they indulged in ancient Rome, which were horridly voluptuous, with refinements of sensuality which were so complicated that she could not even picture them to herself. The boulevards seemed to her to be a kind of abyss of human passions, and there could be no doubt that the houses there concealed mysteries of prodigious love. But she felt that she was growing old, and this without having known life, except in those regular, horridly monotonous, everyday occupations which constitute the happiness of the home. She was still pretty, for she was well preserved in her tranquil existence, like some winter fruit in a closed cupboard. But she was agitated and devoured by her secret ardor. She used to ask herself whether she should die without having experienced any of those damning, intoxicating joys, without having plunged once, just once, into that flood of Parisian voluptuousness. By dint of much perseverance, she paved the way for a journey to Paris, found a pretext, got some relations to invite her, and as her husband could not go with her, she went alone, and as soon as she arrived, she invented a reason for remaining for 2 days, or rather for 2 nights if necessary, as she told him that she had met some friends who lived a little way out of town. And then she set out on a voyage of discovery. She went up and down the boulevards without seeing anything except roving and numbered vice. She looked into the large cafés and read the agony column of the Figaro, which every morning seemed to her like a tocsin, a summons to love. But nothing put her on the track of those orgies of actors and actresses. Nothing revealed to her those temples of debauchery which she imagined opened at some magic word, like the cave in the Arabian Nights, or those catacombs in Rome where the mysteries of a persecuted religion were secretly celebrated. Her relations, who were quite middle-class people, could not introduce her to any of those well-known men with whose names her head was full, and in despair she was thinking of returning, when chance came to her aid. One day, as she was going along the Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin, she stopped to look into a shop full of those colored Japanese knickknacks, which strike the eye on account of their color. She was looking at the little ivory buffoons, the tall vases of flaming enamel, and the curious bronzes, when she heard the shopkeeper dilating with many bows on the value of an enormous, pot-bellied, comical figure which was quite unique, he said to a little bald-headed, gray-bearded man. Every moment the shopkeeper repeated his customer's name, which was a celebrated one, in a voice like a trumpet. The other customers, young women and well-dressed gentlemen, gave a swift and furtive but respectful glance at the celebrated writer, who was looking admirably at the china figure. They were both equally ugly as 2 brothers who had sprung from the same mother. I will let you have it for 1,000 francs, Monsieur Varin, and that is exactly what it cost me. I should ask anybody else 1,500, but I think a great deal of literary and artistic customers, and have special prices for them. They all come to me, Monsieur Varin. Yesterday, Monsieur Busnac bought a large antique goblet of me, and the other day I sold 2 candelabra like this, is it not handsome, to Monsieur Alexander Dumas. If Monsieur Zola were to see that Japanese figure, he would buy it immediately, Monsieur Varin." The author hesitated in perplexity, as he wanted to have the figure, but the price was above him, and he thought no more about her looking at him than if he had been alone in the desert. She came in trembling, with her eyes fixed shamelessly upon him, and she did not even ask herself whether he were good-looking, elegant, or young. It was Jean Varin himself, Jean Varin. After a long struggle and painful hesitation, he put the figure down onto the table. "No, it is too dear," he said. The shopkeeper's eloquence redoubled. "Oh, Monsieur Varin, too dear? It is worth 2,000 francs if it is worth a son." But the man of letters replied sadly, still looking at the figure with the enameled eyes, "I do not say it is not, but it is too dear for me." And thereupon she, seized by a kind of mad audacity, came forward and said, "What shall you charge me for the figure?" The shopkeeper, in surprise, replied, 1,500 francs, madame." "I will take it." The writer, who had not even noticed her till that moment, turned round suddenly. He looked at her from head to foot, with half-closed eyes, observantly, and then he took in the details as a connoisseur. She was charming, suddenly animated by that flame which had hitherto been dormant in her. And then a woman who gives 1,500 francs for a knick-knack is not to be met with every day. But she was overcome by a feeling of delightful delicacy, and turning to him, she said in a trembling voice, "Excuse me, monsieur. No doubt I have been rather hasty, as perhaps you had not finally made up your mind." He, however, only bowed and said, "Indeed I had, madame." And she, filled with emotion, continued, "Well, monsieur, if either today or at any other time you change your mind, you can have this Japanese figure. I only bought it because you seemed to like it." He was visibly flattered, and smiled. "I should much like to find out how you know who I am," he said. Then she told him how she admired him, and became quite eloquent as she quoted his works. And while they were talking, he rested his arms on a table, and fixed his bright eyes upon her, trying to make out who and what she really was. But the shopkeeper, who was pleased to have that living puff of his goods, called out from the other end of the shop, "Just look at this, Monsieur Varin. Is it not beautiful?" And then everyone looked round, and she almost trembled with pleasure at being seen talking so intimately with such a well-known man. At last, however, intoxicated as it were by her feelings, she grew bold, like a general does who is going to give the order for an assault. "Monsieur," she said, "will you do me a great and very great pleasure? Allow me to offer you this funny Japanese figure as a keepsake from a woman who admires you passionately, and whom you have seen for 10 minutes." Of course he refused, and she persisted, but still he resisted her offer, at which he was much amused, and at which he laughed heartily. But that only made her more obstinate, and she said, "Very well, then, I shall take it to your house immediately. Where do you live?" He refused to give her his address, but she got it from the shopkeeper, and when she had paid for her purchase, she ran out to take a cab. The writer went after her, as he did not wish to accept a present for which he could not possibly account. He reached her just as she was jumping into the vehicle, and getting in after her, he almost fell onto her, and then tumbled onto the bottom of the cab as it started. He picked himself up, however, and sat down by her side, feeling very much annoyed. It was no good for him to insist and to beg her. She showed herself intractable, and when they got to the door she stated her conditions. "I will undertake not to leave this with you," she said, "if you will promise to do all I want today." And the whole affair seemed so funny to him that he agreed. "What do you generally do at this time?" she asked him, and after hesitating for a few moments, he replied, "I generally go for a walk." "Very well, then, we will go to the Bois de Boulogne," she said in a resolute voice, and they started. He was obliged to tell her the names of all the well-known women, pure or impure, with every detail about them, their life, their habits, their private affairs, and their vices. And when it was getting dusk, she said to him, "What do you do every day at this time?" "I have some absinthe," he replied with a laugh. "Very well, then, monsieur," she went on seriously, "let us go and have some absinthe." They went into a large café on the boulevard which he frequented, and where he met some of his colleagues, whom he introduced to her. She was half mad with pleasure, and she kept saying to herself, "At last, at last!" But time went on, and she observed that she supposed it must be about his dinner time, and she suggested that they should go and dine. When they left Bignon's after dinner, she wanted to know what he did in the evening, and looking at her fixedly, he replied, "That depends. Sometimes I go to the theater." "Very well, then, monsieur, let us go to the theater." They went to the vaudeville with an order, thanks to him, and to her great pride, the whole house saw her sitting by his side in the balcony stalls. When the play was over, he gallantly kissed her hand and said, "It only remains for me to thank you for this delightful day." But she interrupted him. "What do you do at this time every night?" Why, I go home." She began to laugh, a little tremulous laugh. "Very well, monsieur, let us go to your rooms." They did not say anything more. She shivered occasionally from head to foot, feeling inclined to stay and inclined to run away, but with a fixed determination, after all, to see it out to the end. She was so excited that she had to hold on to the baluster as she went upstairs, and he came up behind her with a wax match in his hand. As soon as they were in the room, she undressed herself quickly and retired without saying a word, and then she waited for him, cowering against the wall. But she was as simple as it was possible for a provincial lawyer's wife to be, and he was more exacting than a pasha with 3 tails, and so they did not at all understand each other. At last, however, he went to sleep, and the night passed, and the silence was only disturbed by the tick-tack of the clock, and she, lying motionless, thought of her conjugal nights. And by the light of the Chinese lantern she looked, nearly heartbroken, at the little fat man lying on his back, whose round stomach raised up the bedclothes like a balloon filled with gas. He snored with the noise of a wheezy organ pipe, with prolonged snorts and comic chokings. His few hairs profited by his sleep to stand up in a very strange way, as if they were tired of having been fastened for so long to that pate, whose bareness they were trying to cover, and a small stream of saliva was running out of one corner of his half-open mouth. At last the daylight appeared through the drawn blinds, so she got up and dressed herself without making any noise, and she had already half opened the door when she made the lock creak, and he woke up and rubbed his eyes. He was some moments before he quite came to himself, and then, when he remembered all that had happened, he said, "What? Are you going already?" She remained standing in some confusion, and then she said in a hesitating voice, "Yes, of course, it is morning." Then he sat up and said, "Look here, I have something to ask you in my turn." And as she did not reply, he went on, "You have surprised me most confoundedly since yesterday. Be open and tell me why you did it all, for upon my word I cannot understand it in the least." She went close up to him, blushing like as if she had been a virgin, and said, "I wanted to know what vice really was, and, well, it is not at all funny." And she ran out of the room and downstairs into the street. A number of sweepers were busy in the streets, brushing the pavements, the roadway, and sweeping everything on one side. With the same regular motion, the motion of mowers in a meadow, they pushed the mud in front of them in a semicircle, and she met them in every street, like dancing puppets, walking automatically with their swaying motion. And it seemed to her as if something had been swept out of her, as if her overexcited dreams had been pushed into the gutter or into the drain. And so she went home, out of breath and very cold, and all that she could remember was the sensation of the motion of those brooms sweeping the streets of Paris in the early morning. As soon as she got into her room, she threw herself onto her bed and cried. End of section 48. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 49 of the works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Madame Baptiste. When I went into the waiting room at the station at Loubain, the first thing I did was to look at the clock, and I found that I had 2 hours and 10 minutes to wait for the Paris express. I felt suddenly tired, as if I had walked 20 miles, and then I looked about me as if I could find some means of killing the time on the station walls. And at last I went out again and stopped outside the gates of the station, racking my brains to find something to do. The street, which was a kind of a boulevard, planted with acacias, between 2 rows of houses of unequal shape and different styles of architecture, houses such as one only sees in a small town, ascended a slight hill, and at the extreme end of it there were some trees, as if it ended in a park. From time to time a cat crossed the street and jumped over the gutters carefully. A cur sniffed at every tree and hunted for fragments from the kitchens, but I did not see a single human being, and I felt listless and disheartened. What could I do with myself? I was already thinking of the inevitable and interminable visit to the small café at the railway station, where I should have to sit over a glass of undrinkable beer and the illegible newspaper, when I saw a funeral procession coming out of a side street into the one in which I was, and the sight of the hearse was a relief to me. It would, at any rate, give me something to do for 10 minutes. Suddenly, however, my curiosity was aroused. The corpse was followed by 8 gentlemen, one of whom was weeping, while the others were chatting together. But there was no priest, and I thought to myself, this is a non-religious funeral. But then I reflected that a town like Loubain must contain at least 100 freethinkers, who would have made a point of making a manifestation. What could it be, then? The rapid pace of the procession clearly proved that the body was to be buried without ceremony, and consequently without the intervention of religion. My idle curiosity framed the most complicated suppositions, and as the hearse passed me, a strange idea struck me, which was to follow it with the 8 gentlemen. That would take up my time for an hour, at least, and I, accordingly, walked with the others, with a sad look on my face. And on seeing this, the 2 last turned round in surprise, and then spoke to each other in a low voice. No doubt they were asking each other whether I belonged to the town, and then they consulted the 2 in front of them, who stared at me in turn. This close attention which they paid me annoyed me, and to put an end to it, I went up to them, and after bowing, I said, "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, for interrupting your conversation, but seeing a civil funeral, I have followed it, although I did not know the deceased gentleman whom you are accompanying." "It is a woman," one of them said. I was much surprised at hearing this, and asked, "But it is a civil funeral, is it not?" The other gentleman, who evidently wished to tell me all about it, then said, "Yes and no. The clergy have refused to allow us the use of the church." On hearing that, I uttered a prolonged "ah" of astonishment. I could not understand it all, but my obliging neighbor continued, "It is rather a long story. This young woman committed suicide, and that is the reason why she cannot be buried with any religious ceremony. The gentleman who was walking first, and who was crying, is her husband." I replied with some hesitation, "You surprise and interest me very much, monsieur. Shall I be indiscreet if I ask you to tell me the facts of the case? If I am troubling you, think that I have said nothing about the matter." The gentleman took my arm familiarly. "Not at all. Let us stop a little behind the others, and I will tell it you, although it is a very sad story. We have plenty of time before getting to the cemetery, whose trees you see up yonder, for it is a stiff pull up this hill." And he began, "This young woman, Madame Paul Hameau, was the daughter of a wealthy merchant in the neighborhood, Monsieur Fontenelle. When she was a mere child of 11, she had a terrible adventure. A footman violated her. She nearly died in consequence, and the wretch's brutality betrayed him. A terrible criminal case was the result, and it was proved that for 3 months the poor young martyr had been the victim of that brute's disgraceful practices, and he was sentenced to penal servitude for life. The little girl grew up stigmatized by disgrace, isolated without any companions, and grown-up people would scarcely kiss her, for they thought that they would soil their lips if they touched her forehead. And she became a sort of monster, a phenomenon to all the town. People said to each other in a whisper, 'You know little Fontenelle,' and everybody turned away in the streets when she passed. Her parents could not even get a nurse to take her out for a walk, as the other servants held aloof from her, as if contact with her would poison everybody who came near her. It was pitiable to see the poor child. She remained quite by herself, standing by her maid, and looking at the other children amusing themselves. Sometimes, yielding to an irresistible desire to mix with the other children, she advanced timidly, with nervous gestures, and mingled with a group with furtive steps, as if conscious of her own infamy. And immediately the mothers, aunts, and nurses used to come running from every seat, who took the children entrusted to their care by the hand and dragged them brutally away. Little Fontenelle remained isolated, wretched, without understanding what it meant, and then she began to cry, nearly heartbroken with grief, and then she used to run and hide her head in her nurse's lap, sobbing. As she grew up, it was worse still. They kept the girls from her as if she were stricken with the plague. Remember that she had nothing to learn, nothing, that she no longer had the right to the symbolical wreath of orange flowers, that almost before she could read, she had penetrated that redoubtable mystery which mothers scarcely allow their daughters to guess, trembling as they enlighten them on the night of their marriage. When she went through the streets, always accompanied by her governess, as if her parents feared some fresh, terrible adventure, with her eyes cast down under the load of that mysterious disgrace which she felt was always weighing upon her, the other girls, who were not nearly so innocent as people thought, whispered and giggled as they looked at her knowingly, and immediately turned their heads absently if she happened to look at them. People scarcely greeted her. Only a few men bowed to her, and the mothers pretended not to see her, whilst some young blackguards called her Madame Baptiste, after the name of the footman who had outraged and ruined her. Nobody knew the secret torture of her mind, for she hardly ever spoke and never laughed, and her parents themselves appeared uncomfortable in her presence, as if they bore her a constant grudge for some irreparable fault. An honest man would not willingly give his hand to a liberated convict, would he? Even if that convict were his own son? And Monsieur and Madame Fontenelle looked on their daughter as they would have done on a son who had just been released from the hulks. She was pretty and pale, tall, slender, distinguished looking, and she would have pleased me very much, monsieur, but for that unfortunate affair. Well, when a new sub-prefect was appointed here 18 months ago, he brought his private secretary with him. He was a queer sort of fellow who had lived in the Latin Quarter, it appears. He saw Mademoiselle Fontenelle and fell in love with her, and when told of what occurred, he merely said, "Bah! That is just a guarantee for the future, and I would rather it should have happened before I married her than afterwards. I shall sleep tranquilly with that woman." He paid his addresses to her, asked for her hand, and married her, and then, not being deficient in boldness, he paid wedding calls, as if nothing had happened. Some people returned them, others did not, but at last the affair began to be forgotten, and she took her proper place in society. She adored her husband as if he had been a god, for you must remember he had restored her to honor and to social life, that he had braved public opinion, faced insults, and, in a word, performed such a courageous act as few men would accomplish, and she felt the most exalted and uneasy love for him. When she became pregnant, and it was known, the most particular people and the greatest sticklers opened their doors to her, as if she had been definitely purified by maternity. It is funny, but so it is, and thus everything was going on as well as possible when, the other day, was the feast of the patron saint of our town. The prefect, surrounded by his staff and the authorities, presided at the musical competition, and when he had finished his speech, the distribution of medals began, which Paul Hameau, his private secretary, handed to those who were entitled to them. As you know, there are always jealousies and rivalries, which make people forget all propriety. All the ladies of the town were there on the platform, and in his proper turn the bandmaster from the village of Mormion came up. This band was only to receive a second-class medal, for one cannot give first-class medals to everybody, can one? But when the private secretary handed him his badge, the man threw it in his face and exclaimed, "You may keep your medal for Baptiste. You owe him a first-class one also, just as you do me." There were a number of people there who began to laugh. The common herd are neither charitable nor refined, and every eye was turned towards that poor lady. Have you ever seen a woman going mad, monsieur? Well, we were present at the sight. She got up and fell back on her chair 3 times following, as if she had wished to make her escape, but saw that she could not make her way through the crowd. And then another voice in the crowd exclaimed, "Oh, Madame Baptiste!" And a great uproar, partly laughter and partly indignation, arose. The word was repeated over and over again. People stood on tiptoe to see the unhappy woman's face. Husbands lifted their wives up in their arms so that they might see the unhappy woman's face. And people asked, "Which is she? The one in blue?" The boys crowded like cocks, and laughter was heard all over the place. She did not move now on her state chair, just as if she had been put there for the crowd to look at. She could not move, nor disappear, nor hide her face. Her eyelids blinked quickly, as if a vivid light were shining in her face, and she panted like a horse that is going up a steep hill, so that it almost broke one's heart to see it. Meanwhile, however, Monsieur Hameau had seized the ruffian by the throat, and they were rolling on the ground together, amidst a scene of indescribable confusion, and the ceremony was interrupted. An hour later, as the Hameaus were returning home, the young woman, who had not uttered a word since the insult, but who was trembling as if all her nerves had been set in motion by springs, suddenly sprang on the parapet of the bridge, and threw herself into the river before her husband could prevent her. The water is very deep under the arches, and it was 2 hours before her body was recovered. Of course, she was dead. The narrator stopped, and then added, "It was, perhaps, the best thing she could do in her position. There are some things which cannot be wiped out, and now you understand why the clergy refused to have her taken into church. Ah, if it had been a religious funeral, the whole town would have been present. But you can understand that her suicide added to the other affair, and made families abstain from attending her funeral. And then, it is not an easy matter here to attend a funeral which is performed without religious rites. We passed through the cemetery gates, and I waited, much moved by what I had heard, until the coffin had been lowered into the grave, before I went up to the poor fellow, who was sobbing violently, to press his hand vigorously. He looked at me in surprise through his tears, and then said, "Thank you, monsieur." And I was not sorry that I had followed the funeral. End of section 49. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 50 of the Works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Happiness. The sky was blue, with light clouds that looked like swans slowly sailing on the waters of a lake, and the atmosphere was so warm, so saturated with the subtle odors of the mimosas, that Madame de Viellemont ordered coffee to be served on the terrace which overlooked the sea. And while the steam rose from the delicate china cups, one felt an almost inexpressible pleasure in looking at the sails which were gradually becoming lost in the mysterious distance, and at the almost motionless sea, which had the sheen of jewels, which attracted the eyes like the looks of a dreamy woman. Monsieur de Pardillac, who had arrived from Paris fresh from the remembrance of the last election there, from that carnival of variegated posters, which for weeks had imparted the strange aspect of some oriental bazaar to the whole city, had just been relating the victory of the general, and went on to say that those who had thought that the game was lost were beginning to hope again. After listening to him, old Count de Lancôme, who had spent his whole life in rummaging libraries, and who had certainly compiled more manuscripts than any Benedictine friar, shook his bald head, and exclaimed in a shrill, rather mocking voice, "Will you allow me to tell you a very old story, which has just come into my head while you were speaking, my dear friend, which I read formerly in an old Italian city, though I forget at this moment where it was. It happened in the 15th century, which is far removed from our epoch, but you shall judge for yourselves whether it might not have happened yesterday. Since the day when, mad with rage and rebellion, the town had made a bonfire of the ducal palace, and had ignominiously expelled that patrician who had been their podestat, as if he had been some vicious scoundrel, had thrust his lovely daughter into a convent, and had forced his sons, who might have claimed their parental heritage, and have again imposed the abhorred yoke upon them, into a monastery, the town had never known any prosperous times. One after another the shops closed, and money became as scarce as if there had been an invasion of barbarian hordes, who had emptied the state treasury and stolen the last gold coin. The poor people were in abject misery, and in vain held out their hands to passers-by under the church porches and in the squares, while only the watchmen disturbed the silence of the starlit nights by their monotonous and melancholy call, which announced the flight of the hours as they passed. There were no more serenades. No longer did viols and flutes trouble the slumbers of the lover's choice. No longer were amorous arms thrown round women's supple waists, nor were bottles of red wine put to cool in the fountains under the trees. There were no more love adventures to the rhythm of laughter and of kisses. Nothing but heavy, monotonous weariness and the anxiety as to what the next day might bring forth, and ceaseless, unbridled ambitions and lusts. The palaces were deserted one by one as if the plague were raging, and the nobility had fled to Florence and to Rome. In the beginning, the common people, artisans, and shopkeepers had installed themselves in power, as in a conquered city, and had seized posts of honor and well-paid offices, and had sacked the treasury with their greedy and eager hands. After them came the middle classes, and those solemn upstarts and hypocrites, like leathern bottles blown out with wind, acting the tyrant and lying without the least shame, disowned their former promises, and would soon have given the finishing stroke to the unfortunate city, which was already at its last shifts. Discontent was increasing, and the sbirri could scarcely find time to tear the seditious placards which had been posted up by unknown hands from the walls. But now that the old podestat had died in exile, worn out with grief, and that his children, who had been brought up under monastic rules and were accustomed to nothing so much as to praying, thought only of their own salvation, there was nobody who could take his place. And so these kinglets profited by the occasion to strut about at their ease like great nobles, to cram themselves with luxurious meals, to increase their property by degrees, to put everything up for sale, and to get rid of those who, later on, could have called for accounts and have nailed them to the pillory by their ears. Their arrogance knew no bounds, and when they were questioned about their acts, they only replied by menaces or raillery, and this state of affairs lasted for 20 years, when, as war was imminent with Lucca, the council raised troops and enrolled mercenaries. Several battles were fought in which the enemy was beaten and was obliged to flee, abandoning their colors, their arms, prisoners, and all the booty in their camp. The man who had led the soldiers from battle, whom they had acclaimed as triumphant and laurel-crowned Caesar around their campfires, was a poor condottiere, who possessed nothing in the world except his clothes, his buff jerkin, and his heavy sword. They called him Hercules on account of his strong muscles, his imposing build, and his large head, and also Malavista, because in those butcheries he had no pity, no weakness, but seemed with his great murderous arms as if he had the long reach of death itself. He had neither title, deeds, fortune, nor relations, for he had been born one night in the tent of a female camp follower. For a long time an old broken drum had been his cradle, and he had grown up anyhow, without knowing those maternal kisses and endearments that warm the heart, or the pleasure of not always sleeping on a hard bed, or of always eating tough beef, or of being obliged to tighten his sword belt when luck had turned, like a weathercock when the wind shifts, and a man would gladly give all his share of the next booty for a moldy crust of bread and a glass of water. He was a simple and a brave man, whose heart was as virgin as some virgin shore on which no human foot has ever yet left its imprint. The chiefs of the council were imprudent enough to summon Hercules Malavista within the walls of the town, and to celebrate his arrival with almost imperial splendor. More, however, to deceive the people and to regain their waning popularity by means of someone else, by a ceremony copied from those of pagan Rome, than to honor and recompense the services of a soldier whom they despised at the bottom of their hearts. The bells rang a full peal, and the archbishop and clergy and choir boys went to meet the captain, singing psalms and hymns of joy, as if it might have been Easter. The streets and squares were strewn with branches of box roses and marjoram, while the meanest homes were decorated with flags and hung with drapery and rich stuffs. The conqueror came in through Trajan's gate, bareheaded, and with the symbolical golden laurel wreath on his head, and sitting on his horse, that was as black as a starless night, he appeared even taller, more vigorous, and more masculine than he really was. He had a joyous and tranquil smile on his lips, and a hidden fire was burning in his eyes, and his soldiers bore the flags and the trophies that he had gained before him, and behind him there was a noise of clashing partisans and crossbows, and of loud voices shouting vivats in his honor. In this fashion he traversed all the quarters of the town, and even the suburbs. The women thought him handsome and proud, blew kisses to him, and held up their children so that they might see him, and he might touch them, and the men cheered him and looked at him with emotion, and many of them reflected and dreamt about that bright, unknown man, who appeared to be surrounded by a halo of glory. The members of the council began to perceive the extent of the almost irreparable fault that they had committed, and did not know what to do in order to ward off the danger by which they were menaced, and to rid themselves of a guest who was quite ready to become their master. They saw clearly that their hours were numbered, that they were approaching that fatal period at which rioting becomes imminent, when the leaders are carried away with it, like pieces of straw in a swift current. Hercules could not show himself in public without being received with shouts of acclamation and noisy greetings, and deputations from the nobility as well as from the people came repeatedly and told him that he had only to make a sign and to say a word for his name to be in every mouth and for his authority to be accepted. They begged him on their knees to accept the supreme authority as though he would be conferring a favor on them. But the freelance did not seem to understand them and repelled their offers with the superb indifference of a soldier who has nothing to do with the people or a crown. At length, however, his resistance grew weaker. He felt the intoxication of power and grew accustomed to the idea of holding the lives of thousands in his hands, of having a palace, arsenals full of arms, chests full of gold, ships which he could send on adventurous cruises wherever he pleased, and of governing that city with all its houses and all its churches, and of being a leading figure at all grand functions in the cathedral. The shopkeepers and merchants were overcome by terror at this, and bowed before the shadow of that great sword, which might sweep them all away and upset their false weights and scales. So they assembled secretly in a monastery of the Carmelite friars outside the gates of the city, and a short time afterwards the weaver Marconelli and the money-changer Ripone brought Gioconda, who was one of the most beautiful courtesans in Venice, and who knew every secret in the art of love, and whose kisses were a foretaste of paradise, back with them from that city. She soon managed to touch the soldier with her delicate fair skin, to make him inhale its bewitching odor in close proximity, and to dazzle him with her large dark eyes, in which the reflection of stars seemed to shine. And when he had once tasted that feast of love, and that heavy wine of kisses, when he had clasped that pink and white body in his arms, and had listened to that voice which sounded as soft as music, and which promised him eternities of joy and vowed to him eternities of pleasures, Hercules lost his head and forgot his dreams and his oaths. Why lose precious hours in conspiring, in deluding himself with chimeras? Why risk his life when he loved and was loved, and when the minutes were all too short, when he would have wished never to detach his lips from those of the woman he loved? And so he did whatever Gioconda demanded. They fled from the city without even telling the sentinels who were on guard before his palace. They went far, far away, as they could not find any retreat that was sufficiently unknown and hidden. And at last they stopped at a small, quiet fishing village, where there were gardens full of lemon trees, where the deserted beach looked as if it were covered with gold, and where the sea was a deep blue until it was lost in the distance. And while the captain and the courtesan loved each other, and wore themselves out with pleasure, with the enchantment of the sea close to them, the irritated citizens whom he had left were clamoring for their idol, were indignant at his desertion, and tore up the paving stones in the streets to stone the man who had betrayed their confidence and worship. And they pulled his statue down from its pedestal, amidst spiteful songs and jokes, and the members of the council breathed again, as they were no longer afraid of the great sword. End of section 50, recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. End of the works of Guy de Maupassant, Volume 3, by Guy de Maupassant.